Today, we're going to discuss the JVP waveform. Here's a general cardiac cycle, and the main focus is the right side of the heart, since the pressure in the jugular vein is directly related to the pressure in the right atrium, and also indirectly related to the pressure in the right ventricle. Let's look at the normal JVP waveform with its fluctuating pressures. We have five main components, and we are expected to know what they represent. First, we can study a simplified version, and it shows two peaks and two troughs. To understand the JVP, we must understand five rules. Most of them are quite obvious. The first rule is that the only way to get a peak in the JVP is for pressure to be exerted on the right atrium, leading to a backup of blood into the jugular vein. Rule number two states that the only way to get a trough or a descent is for the blood to leave from the atrium and go into the ventricle. Rule 3 is that peaks are strictly controlled by atrial activity with one exception, that's the C wave. Rule 4 states that troughs are strictly controlled by ventricular activity. And finally, peaks and troughs can either be formed passively or actively. When we say active, we mean that the chamber has contracted, and passive is a wave formation in the absence of any contraction. Now, let's go back to the simplified version of the wave. And based on the guidelines, we can recognize that this structure is a peak. We can tell that since it represents a buildup of pressure in the atrium. And since it is a peak, we already know it must have been formed by atrial activity, since the atrium controls peak formations. The only thing we must clarify is whether this peak was actively formed or passively formed. And the physiology of the cardiac cycle tells us that this is formed by atrial contraction. So that's the A wave. Now let's look at the other peak. Keep the same approach. We know it represents something about pressure building up since it is a peak. We also know that since it's a peak, it's happening in the atrium because the atrium controls peak formations. And we could also say that since the first peak was actively formed, this peak must be passively formed. This also must represent blood passively filling the atria, and it's causing the JVP to rise, and so that's a V wave. The troughs are similar. It's the same approach. The first trough is actively formed, and the second is passively formed. So it's a pattern. Active peak, active trough, passive peak, and a passive trough. If we look at trough A, we know it's being formed as blood has left the atrium to go into the ventricle, but the major contributor to this trough is the systolic action of the ventricle expelling the blood out and resulting in decreased right chamber pressures and an indirect decrease to the JVP. Trough A therefore represents active ventricular activity, which produces the X descent. Also occurring here is the C wave. So we just explained that this trough is as a result of the right ventricle contracting. When this happens, there's a state where right ventricular pressure is building, but it hasn't reached enough pressure to open the pulmonary valve as yet. So all the valves relating to this right ventricle are bulging due to the increased pressure. This would include the pulmonary valve as well as the tricuspid valve. This state is known by a fancy term called the isovolumetric contraction. Eventually, the pulmonary valve will give way and it allows blood to flow into the lungs. But it's the bulging of the tricuspid valve into the atrium from this isovolumetric contraction pressure is what gives rise to the C wave. It is hardly seen clinically anyway, but examiners and academic medicine, they love to ask about it. The last component is an X trough, which we know is as a result of something passively occurring in the ventricle. This represents the passive filling of the ventricle when its tricuspid valve opens, which leads to less blood in the right atrium and hence a decrease in JVP. This forms the Y descent. Let's quickly summarize. There are two peaks and two troughs. Peaks are atrial in nature, except for the C wave, and troughs are ventricular in nature. The pattern is that there's an active peak, an active trough, a passive peak, passive trough, and then it repeats. The A wave is atrial contraction, the C wave, as well as the X descent, is ventricular contraction or ventricular emptying. V wave is the atrium passively filling, and the Y descent is ventricle passively filling. This cycle then repeats.